What if everything you thought you knew about a famous family was only half the story? Because what Tamar Braxton allegedly revealed has left fans stunned, confused, and honestly, a little unsettled. This wasn't just another emotional moment, or reality TV fallout. This felt different. Heavier. Like something that had been buried for years was suddenly pushed into the light. In a raw and unfiltered moment, Tamar hinted at a truth so disturbing that people are still trying to figure out what it really means, and whether it should have ever been spoken publicly at all. At the center of it, her own family, her own blood, and most shockingly, her own sister, Towanda Braxton. But the most chilling part isn't just the allegation, it's who Tamar's words seem to point back to: Evelyn Braxton, the woman long seen as the foundation of the Braxton legacy. Now the internet is asking one question: is this a painful truth finally being exposed? Or a story far more complicated than it seems? The story surrounding Tamar Braxton and her family didn't begin with a single shocking moment. It built slowly over years, layered with emotion, silence, and what she has described as deeply rooted control. To understand why her recent claims have hit so hard, you have to go back to the foundation of the Braxton household, where faith, discipline, and image were not just values, they were expectations. According to Tamar, growing up in that environment meant learning early on that love and obedience were often intertwined. She has suggested that questioning authority wasn't seen as curiosity or independence, but as defiance. And in a home where respect was closely tied to spiritual beliefs, defiance carried a heavier weight. It wasn't just about disobeying a parent, it was framed as stepping outside of what was morally right. At the center of this structure was Evelyn Braxton, a mother who has long been viewed publicly as strong, disciplined, and deeply rooted in her faith. Tamar has implied that behind that image was a parenting style that relied heavily on control, emotional, psychological, and at times, spiritual. She has carefully stated that what appeared to outsiders as guidance may have felt very different inside the home. In Tamar's telling, each sister adapted differently. Some found ways to navigate the expectations, while others struggled more openly. But one name that keeps coming up in her narrative is Towanda Braxton. Tamar has described Towanda not as weak, but as someone who learned to survive by complying. The obedient one, the one who didn't push back, the one who carried what she was given without making noise about it. That role, Tamar suggests, came with consequences. Over time, she claims, Towanda became the emotional anchor of the family in a way that wasn't entirely fair. She was expected to absorb tension, to maintain peace, and to prioritize the family's unity above her own personal needs. And while that may sound admirable on the surface, Tamar has hinted that it came at a deeper cost, one that wasn't fully visible to outsiders. As the sisters grew older and their lives became more public, especially through television, those internal dynamics didn't disappear, they simply became harder to identify. To viewers, the conflicts looked like typical family disagreements. Arguments between sisters. Emotional outbursts. Moments of tension that seemed to come and go. But Tamar has suggested that those moments were often rooted in something much deeper than what was shown on screen. She has described noticing small things long before she had the language to understand them. Glances that lingered too long. Conversations that ended abruptly when certain topics came up. A kind of discomfort that couldn't easily be explained, but was always present in the background. As a teenager, Tamar says she didn't fully understand what she was seeing, but she knew enough to feel that something wasn't right. According to her, every time she tried to question it, she was met with resistance. Not just dismissal, but a reframing of the situation that made her feel like she was overreacting. She has implied that this pattern repeated itself enough times that she eventually stopped asking questions, not because she stopped noticing, but because she realized the answers weren't meant to be uncovered. What makes this even more complicated is the way Tamar describes the role of faith within the household. She has suggested that spiritual language was sometimes used to reinforce obedience, to justify decisions, and to discourage dissent. In her words, it created an environment where silence wasn't just expected, it was seen as the right thing to do. And for someone like Towanda, Tamar claims, that environment may have been especially difficult to navigate. Because when you're taught that loyalty equals love, and obedience equals worth, it becomes harder to recognize when something feels wrong. Tamar has hinted that this dynamic may have played a significant role in shaping how Towanda responded to certain situations later in life. As the years went on, Tamar says the unease never fully went away. It lingered in the background, becoming easier to ignore at times, but never completely disappearing. And then, according to her, there were moments, brief, quiet moments, where the truth seemed to almost surface. She recalls conversations that felt heavier than they should have been. Statements that didn't quite make sense on their own, but carried an emotional weight that suggested something more. Tamar has implied that it wasn't one big revelation that changed everything. It was a series of smaller realizations that slowly began to connect. And then came the moment she says she can't forget. A private conversation between her and Towanda, away from cameras, away from the pressure of public perception. Tamar has described it as quiet, almost fragile. Not dramatic, not explosive, but deeply emotional. According to Tamar, something was said in that moment that shifted her entire understanding of her sister's past. She hasn't always gone into explicit detail, but she has made it clear that what she heard forced her to reevaluate everything she thought she knew. The roles they played as children. The dynamics within their home. Even the moments that once seemed insignificant suddenly took on new meaning. She has described feeling a mix of shock and confusion, trying to process something that didn't fit into the narrative she had been told her entire life. And more than anything, she has emphasized the emotional impact of realizing that someone she loved may have been carrying something so heavy for so long. From that point forward, Tamar says she couldn't unsee it. Every interaction, every memory, every moment of tension began to feel different. And with that realization came a difficult question: what do you do with a truth that doesn't just affect you, but your entire family? For a long time, Tamar suggests, she chose silence. Not because she didn't believe what she had come to understand, but because speaking out felt like it would break something that couldn't be fixed. She has acknowledged that loyalty played a role in that decision, the same loyalty she now questions. But as time passed, she claims the weight of that silence became harder to carry. Watching Towanda, she says, made it impossible to ignore. The hesitation. The guardedness. The sense that something was still unresolved. Tamar has implied that these observations played a major role in her eventual decision to speak. And when she finally did, it wasn't calculated. It wasn't polished. It came out in a way that reflected just how long she had been holding it in, emotional, fragmented, and deeply personal. She didn't present it as a neatly packaged story with clear answers. Instead, she shared what she knew, how she felt, and why she believed it mattered. That moment changed everything. Not just for Tamar, but for how the public began to see the Braxton family as a whole. Because once a narrative like that is introduced, it's impossible to go back to what people thought they knew before. And at the center of it all remains the same question: how much of the truth has actually been told, and how much is still waiting to come out? As the weight of Tamar Braxton's words began to settle, the story didn't calm down, it intensified. What started as a deeply personal revelation quickly turned into a growing storm of speculation, emotion, and unanswered questions. Because once Tamar opened that door, even slightly, people weren't just listening anymore, they were searching. Searching for context, for patterns, for anything that could help them understand what she was really trying to say without ever fully saying it outright. And at the center of that storm remained Towanda Braxton. Tamar's words had placed her in a position no one could ignore, yet Towanda herself wasn't immediately speaking in detail. That silence, intentional or not, only added to the tension. Because now, every past moment involving her was being revisited through a completely different lens. Fans began pulling up old clips, interviews, and reality show scenes, looking for signs that might have been overlooked. Moments that once seemed ordinary suddenly felt heavier. A pause in conversation. A forced smile. A reaction that didn't quite match the situation. None of it was definitive, but together, it created a sense that maybe something deeper had always been there, just beneath the surface. Tamar, meanwhile, continued to speak carefully, but with a growing sense of urgency. She didn't present herself as someone exposing a clear-cut truth with all the answers. Instead, she spoke like someone trying to make sense of something painful in real time. She used words like allegedly, and from what I understand, leaving room for interpretation, while still making it clear that what she believed was serious. According to Tamar, the turning point wasn't just what she heard, it was what she started to connect afterward. She has implied that once certain pieces came together, it became impossible to separate past from present. The way Evelyn Braxton handled certain conversations. The way topics were shut down. The way emotional reactions seemed disproportionate to what was happening on the surface. Tamar has suggested that when she confronted Evelyn privately, she wasn't met with the kind of response she expected. She didn't describe a dramatic denial or an outright admission. Instead, she implied that the conversation was led, framed in a way that justified actions rather than directly addressing them. And that, for Tamar, was just as unsettling. She has described walking away from that interaction feeling more confused than reassured. Because instead of clarity, she was left with the sense that what she was questioning wasn't being seen the same way by the person she was questioning. And that disconnect created a deeper emotional divide. As this internal conflict grew, Tamar says she struggled with what to do next. Speaking publicly meant risking everything, the family's image, their relationships, and the bond they had spent years presenting to the world. But staying silent, she suggests, felt like participating in something she no longer understood or agreed with. At the same time, she continued to observe Towanda. And according to Tamar, those observations became harder to ignore. She has implied that there were signs, subtle but consistent, that her sister was still carrying something unresolved. A kind of emotional hesitation that showed up in relationships, in conversations, and even in moments that should have been simple. Tamar has carefully avoided making absolute claims about what Towanda experienced, but she has made it clear that she believes her sister was deeply affected by something in their past. And more importantly, she believes that silence played a role in that impact. As the public conversation intensified, so did the pressure on everyone involved. Social media became a space where opinions formed quickly and spread even faster. Some people supported Tamar, seeing her as someone finally speaking up about something difficult. Others questioned the timing, the delivery, and the lack of concrete details. Through it all, one thing remained consistent: uncertainty. Because while Tamar's words were powerful, they weren't presented as a complete story. They were fragments. Pieces of a larger picture that still hadn't fully come into view. And then came a shift that added even more complexity. According to Tamar, there was a moment, another conversation, another exchange, that reinforced everything she had been struggling to process. She has described it as quiet, almost fragile, but deeply impactful. In that moment, Tamar claims, Towanda said something that connected the emotional weight Tamar had been sensing for years. Not in a way that spelled everything out clearly, but in a way that confirmed that there was more beneath the surface than anyone had been willing to acknowledge publicly. That moment, Tamar suggests, is what ultimately pushed her closer to speaking out. Because at that point, it wasn't just about her own confusion anymore. It was about what she believed her sister had been carrying in silence. Still, even as she began to share more openly, Tamar remained careful with her language. She didn't claim to have all the answers. She didn't present her perspective as the only truth. Instead, she spoke from her experience, her understanding, and the connections she had made over time. And that approach, while cautious, didn't stop the impact. If anything, it made it more intense. Because the lack of definitive answers left room for interpretation, and interpretation often leads to stronger reactions. Meanwhile, Evelyn Braxton's public silence became a focal point of its own. People began questioning what it meant. Was it a refusal to engage? A strategic decision? Or simply a way of protecting herself and her family from further scrutiny? Tamar has hinted that silence, in this situation, speaks just as loudly as words. But she has also acknowledged that everyone processes situations differently, and that not everyone will choose to respond in the same way. As the situation continued to unfold, the family dynamic appeared to shift in subtle, but noticeable ways. Tamar has suggested that conversations became more strained, that trust was harder to maintain, and that the bond they once presented so confidently now felt more complicated. And yet, despite all of this, there was still no clear resolution. No definitive confirmation. No single moment that tied everything together in a way that answered all the questions being asked. Instead, what remained was a story still in motion. One that had moved beyond private conversations and into public discussion, but still hadn't reached a clear conclusion. Because at its core, this isn't just about what was said, it's about what hasn't been fully explained. It's about the space between words, the weight of silence, and the complexity of family dynamics that don't always fit into clear narratives. And as more people continue to watch, listen, and form their own opinions, one thing is becoming increasingly clear: this story isn't over. Not even close. As the situation reached its most intense point, the focus shifted from what Tamar Braxton had said, to what it all meant for the future of the family. Because once something this heavy enters the public space, it doesn't just fade away, it lingers, it evolves, and it forces everyone involved to respond, even if that response comes in silence. At the center of it all was still Towanda Braxton. For days, her presence online felt almost like a question mark. Every post, every absence, every small move carried weight. Tamar had already made it clear that she believed her sister deserved the space to speak on her own terms. But the longer Towanda remained quiet, the more intense the speculation became. And then, slowly, something shifted. Not in a dramatic, headline-grabbing way, but in a way that felt intentional. Towanda began to reappear in subtle ways, and while she didn't immediately address everything directly, the tone of her presence felt different. More reflective. More guarded, but also more open than before. It was as if she was trying to find a balance between protecting herself and acknowledging the weight of what had been said. According to Tamar, this was always the hardest part, the moment where truth and consequence collide. Because speaking out doesn't just release what's been hidden, it changes relationships. It redefines roles. It forces people to confront things they may not be ready to face. Behind the scenes, Tamar has suggested that conversations within the family became unavoidable. Not necessarily explosive, but deeply emotional. She has implied that there were moments where everything had to be laid out, feelings, memories, perspectives, whether people agreed or not. And in those moments, the idea of unity became more complicated than it had ever been before. At the center of those conversations, once again, was Evelyn Braxton. Tamar has carefully avoided presenting her as a one-dimensional figure, but she has made it clear that their relationship has been affected in ways that may not easily be repaired. She has hinted that Evelyn sees things differently, that what Tamar views as something that needs to be addressed, Evelyn may view through an entirely different lens. And that difference in perspective is what makes resolution so difficult. Because when two people interpret the same situation in completely different ways, finding common ground becomes almost impossible. Tamar has suggested that this isn't just about one moment or one allegation, it's about years of dynamics, beliefs, and decisions that have shaped how each person understands the past. As the public conversation continued, the impact on the family's image became impossible to ignore. For years, the Braxtons were seen as a symbol of strength, talent, and resilience. Now, that image felt more fragile. Not necessarily broken, but certainly more complex than it once appeared. Fans who had followed their journey for years found themselves re-evaluating what they had seen. Moments that once felt entertaining now carried a different emotional weight. Interactions that once seemed harmless now felt layered with meaning. And while no one could say with certainty what was true and what wasn't, the perception had already shifted. Tamar has acknowledged this shift, but she has also made it clear that public perception was never her main concern. According to her, this was about something deeper, about honesty, about accountability, and about breaking patterns that she believes have existed for far too long. Still, that doesn't mean the consequences have been easy to navigate. She has hinted at the emotional toll of speaking out, the backlash, the misunderstandings, the pressure of having her words analyzed from every angle. But despite that, she has stood by her decision, suggesting that staying silent would have been harder in the long run. As for Towanda, Tamar has expressed a mix of pride and concern. Pride in what she sees as her sister's strength, but concern for the emotional weight that comes with stepping into the spotlight in this way. Because once a story like this becomes public, it doesn't just belong to the people involved. It becomes part of a larger conversation that can be difficult to control. And that's exactly what happened. The discussion moved beyond the Braxton family and into broader conversations about family dynamics, about control, about the ways people are taught to define love and loyalty. Experts, commentators, and everyday viewers all began sharing their perspectives, connecting the story to experiences that felt familiar in different ways. Tamar has acknowledged this broader impact, suggesting that if anything positive comes from the situation, it's the opportunity for people to reflect on their own lives, to question what they've been taught, to recognize patterns that may not be healthy, even if they've been normalized over time. But even with all of that, one thing remains unresolved: the future of the relationships within the family. Tamar has been open about the fact that healing isn't guaranteed. That sometimes, bringing truth to the surface creates space for growth, but it can also create distance. She has suggested that rebuilding trust takes time, and that it requires everyone involved to be willing to engage in difficult conversations. And while she hasn't closed the door on reconciliation, she has also been honest about the uncertainty of what that might look like moving forward. Meanwhile, Evelyn Braxton's continued restraint in addressing the situation publicly has only added to the complexity. Some see it as strength. Others see it as avoidance. Tamar, for her part, has implied that silence can mean many things, and that understanding those meanings isn't always straightforward. What's clear, though, is that the dynamic has changed. The roles, the expectations, the unspoken rules, they've all been challenged in a way that can't easily be undone. And while time may bring clarity, it may not bring the kind of resolution people are hoping for. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't tie everything together neatly. Sometimes, it simply reveals what was already there, complicated, messy, and difficult to define. And that's where things stand now. Not at an ending, but at a turning point. A moment where everything that's been said continues to ripple outward, affecting not just how the world sees the Braxton family, but how they see each other. The story is no longer just about what happened, it's about what happens next. Now, after everything you've just heard, I really want to know where you stand on this, because this isn't a simple story with a clear right or wrong. Do you believe Tamar Braxton spoke out to finally protect her sister and break years of silence? Or do you think there are still missing pieces we haven't been told yet? And what about Evelyn Braxton? Does her silence feel like strength to you, or does it raise even more questions? And then there's Towanda Braxton. After everything, do you think she's finally finding her voice? Or is this just the beginning of a much deeper story still unfolding? Go ahead and drop your thoughts in the comments, because this conversation is far from over, and your perspective matters more than you think. If this story had you questioning everything, make sure you hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Because trust me, if this is what's coming to light now, the next chapter might be even bigger.